My name is Veronica Hayes, and for the past 5 years, I've been my family's landlord without them knowing it. They think I'm barely scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck in a rundown apartment complex while they lecture me about responsibility and success. What they don't know is that I own the building I supposedly rent from. I own the townhouse my parents lease. I own the colonial my sister rents in Savannah. In fact, I own 340 properties across 15 states, and every month, their rent checks come directly to me through companies they've never connected to my name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At my sister's destination wedding in Clearwater Beach, surrounded by marble columns and champagne fountains paid for by my parents' retirement fund, they stood in front of 200 guests and made jokes about my financial failures. They laughed about how I'd never amount to anything, how I'd always be stuck asking for help. That's when I decided it was time to stop playing poor. That's when I handed my sister an envelope that contained every lease agreement, every LLC document, every single proof that I'd been quietly building an empire while they built their egos. And the screaming that followed made the ocean waves sound like whispers. The morning of Kristin's wedding started like every family gathering I'd attended for the past decade. I woke up in a hotel room I'd booked myself, not the resort where everyone else stayed because my mother made it clear there wasn't space in the family block for me. The message had come through 3 weeks before the wedding, casual and cutting in that way only Diane Hayes could manage. We've reserved rooms for immediate family and the wedding party. You understand, Ronnie. Budget and all. I'd replied with a simple thumbs up emoji and booked the Comfort Inn 4 miles down the coast. The irony wasn't lost on me that the resort they'd chosen, the Grandview Clearwater, had been on my acquisition list 2 years ago. I'd passed on it. The maintenance costs were astronomical and the staff turnover made it a management nightmare. Now, watching my family throw money at overpriced cocktails and monogrammed napkins, I was glad I'd trusted my instincts. I arrived at the venue just as the morning fog was lifting off the water. The resort sprawled across 12 acres of pristine beachfront, all white stone and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the sunrise like liquid gold. Valets in crisp uniforms opened car doors. A string quartet played something classical near the fountain. It was the kind of place that whispered wealth without ever having to shout it. I pulled up in my 7-year-old Honda Civic, the same car I'd been driving since I started my real estate portfolio. The valet's smile flickered just slightly when he saw it, but he recovered quickly and handed me a ticket with the same courtesy he'd shown the Tesla in front of me. I'd learned a long time ago that people judge books by their covers. I'd built my entire strategy around it. Inside the lobby, I spotted my mother immediately. Diane Hayes had a presence that filled rooms without effort. She wore a champagne-colored dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, her silver hair swept into an elegant twist that had clearly required professional intervention. She stood near the check-in table with Aunt Lorraine, both of them holding mimosas at 9 in the morning, both of them laughing at something that stopped the moment they saw me. My mother's eyes traveled from my simple navy dress to my department store heels to the canvas tote bag I carried instead of a proper clutch. Her expression didn't change, but I felt the assessment like a physical touch. "Oh Ronnie," she said, her voice carrying that perpetual note of disappointment she reserved exclusively for me. "You made it. I wasn't sure you'd have the gas money." Aunt Lorraine covered her mouth, but not quickly enough to hide her smirk. I'd seen that same expression at Christmas dinners, Thanksgiving gatherings, every birthday party where my accomplishments were measured against Kristin's and found lacking. "Your mother mentioned you've been picking up extra shifts," Lorraine added, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Such dedication. It must be hard making ends meet in this economy." I smiled the same smile I'd perfected over years of these interactions. "I manage just fine. Sometimes living simply has its advantages." My mother made a small noise that might have been agreement or dismissal. "Well, try to enjoy yourself today. Kristin's worked so hard for this. She deserves perfection." The implication hung in the air between us. Kristin deserved perfection. I deserved whatever scraps fell from the table. I excused myself and made my way toward the terrace where other early arrivals gathered. The ceremony wasn't for another 3 hours, but apparently there was a pre-wedding brunch that nobody had informed me about. Not surprising. I'd learned to expect exclusion the way other people expected invitations. Through the French doors, I could see my father standing with Brandon, my soon-to-be brother-in-law. Gerald Hayes looked older than I remembered, his hair more gray than brown now, his posture slightly stooped in that way successful men develop after decades of boardroom victories. He'd built a regional pharmaceutical distribution company from the ground up and sold it 5 years ago for enough money to retire comfortably. He was proud of his business acumen. He'd told me more than once that real success came from taking calculated risks and knowing when to strike. I wondered what he'd think if he knew his daughter had taken those exact lessons and built something 3 times the size of what he'd achieved. Brandon saw me first and said something to my father that made them both turn. Brandon Whitmore represented everything my family valued. Harvard MBA. Corner office at a Fortune 500 company. A last name that appeared on buildings downtown. He wore his privilege like cologne, expensive and impossible to ignore. "Ronnie," he called out, waving me over with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for distant acquaintances you're obligated to acknowledge. "We were just talking about the market. Your dad says you're renting over in Tampa. Rough area?" The question wasn't innocent curiosity. It was a setup. I'd watched Brandon operate at enough family dinners to recognize his patterns. He liked to establish dominance early, usually through subtle reminders of his success compared to everyone else's mediocrity. "I live in Coral Bay," I answered simply. "It suits my needs." Brandon nodded slowly, that patronizing expression settling over his features. Sure. Starter neighborhoods. Everyone's got to begin somewhere. I started in a studio in Brooklyn right out of college. Paid my dues, you know. Built character. My father sipped his coffee, saying nothing, but his silence felt like agreement. They both looked at me like I was a project they'd given up on, something that had failed to launch despite their best efforts. The truth sat on my tongue like champagne bubbles. I wanted to tell them that Coral Bay wasn't a starter neighborhood. It was a 156-unit complex I'd purchased 4 years ago for $3.2 million. I'd renovated 40 units, raised rents responsibly, improved the property value by 60%, and now it generated $18,000 monthly in net income. I wanted to explain that my Honda Civic was a choice, not a limitation. That I drove it because wealth whispered and insecurity shouted. That every dollar I didn't spend on impressing people like Brandon went directly into acquiring more properties, more equity, more financial freedom. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I smiled and said, "Everyone's path is different." Brandon clapped my father on the shoulder. "Well, Gerald, at least you've got Kristin. That girl's got her head on straight. Following in your footsteps." My father's face softened in the way it only did when discussing my sister. Kristin's always been driven. Focused. She knows what she wants and goes after it. Unlike some people who just drift through life hoping things work out. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. The message landed exactly where he intended. I excused myself before either of them could continue. The terrace wrapped around the entire south side of the resort, offering unobstructed views of the Gulf of Mexico. I found a quiet corner near the railing and pulled out my phone. 43 unread emails. Most of them were automated reports from my property management system. Rent collected in Georgia. Maintenance request in Tennessee. New tenant application in North Carolina. I scrolled through them mechanically, approving expenditures and flagging items for follow-up. My business partner, Shelby Kirkland, had sent her weekly summary. Portfolio performance strong across all sectors. 2 properties in Louisiana showing higher than expected vacancy rates, recommend price adjustment or incentive program. Austin market heating up, might be good time to acquire additional units if capital available. I made a mental note to call her after the wedding festivities concluded. A shadow fell across my phone screen. I looked up to find cousin Derek standing there, holding a plate piled high with shrimp and prime rib from the brunch buffet I apparently wasn't informed about. Derek had my aunt's sharp features and my uncle's sense of entitlement. He worked in his father's law firm and considered himself an expert on everything from politics to proper investment strategies. "Ronnie Hayes," he said, my name sounding like a punchline in his mouth. "Still grinding away at that office job? What are you now, secretary? Administrative assistant?" "Executive assistant," I corrected, though the title meant nothing to me. It was cover. A convenient explanation for why I worked 40 hours a week at a downtown firm doing data entry and scheduling. Nobody questioned why someone in my position lived modestly. It was expected. Derek bit into a shrimp, chewing thoughtfully. "You know, my firm's always looking for good support staff. I could put in a word if you need something more stable. Better benefits maybe." The offer was wrapped in generosity but delivered with condescension. I could see it in his eyes. The assumption that I needed rescue. That my life was something to be pitted and improved by his intervention. "That's kind of you," I replied evenly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "But I'm content where I am." He shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just saying, at some point you've got to think about your future. Retirement. Investments. Building something. You're not getting any younger." "I'm aware of my age, Derek." Good, good." He popped another shrimp into his mouth. "Just hate to see family struggle, you know? My parents always said you had potential. Shame it never materialized into anything concrete." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me alone with the implication that my potential had been wasted, that I was a cautionary tale whispered at family gatherings as a reminder of what happened when you didn't apply yourself. The ceremony began promptly at noon. White chairs lined the beach in perfect rows. An arch covered in orchids and roses stood where the sand met the water. Kristin appeared at the far end of the aisle looking like something out of a fairy tale. Her dress must have cost $30,000 at minimum. The train alone required 2 attendants to manage. Brandon waited at the altar with the kind of smile that suggested he knew exactly how good they looked together, how perfectly they fit into the image of success and beauty. I sat in the back row, 3 seats from the aisle. When the ushers had been seating people, they directed immediate family to the front, extended family to the middle, and everyone else to the back. I'd watched my mother and father take their places of honor in the front row. I'd watched aunts and uncles and cousins fill in behind them. And then I'd been guided to the back with people I'd never met, distant friends of the groom, plus ones who didn't know anyone. The minister spoke about love and partnership and building a life together. Kristin and Brandon exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams and weather any storm as a team. My mother cried delicate tears that didn't smudge her makeup. My father beamed with pride. When the minister announced them as husband and wife, applause erupted like thunder. I clapped too, my hands coming together in mechanical rhythm while my mind calculated the cost of everything I was watching. The flowers alone represented a month's rent for most people. The photographer probably charged more than I paid my tenants in security deposits. This single day, this elaborate production of wealth and status, likely cost more than the down payment I'd made on my first investment property 10 years ago. The reception followed immediately, transitioning from beach to ballroom with practiced efficiency. Round tables covered in silk linens filled the space. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light. A live band set up on a stage flanked by ice sculptures shaped like swans. I found my assigned seat at table 17, tucked in the far corner near the kitchen doors. My tablemates included a college friend of Brandon's who spent the entire cocktail hour on his phone, an elderly couple I later learned were neighbors of the groom's parents, and 3 empty chairs that suggested people hadn't bothered to show. I didn't mind the isolation. It gave me time to observe. Dinner service began with champagne toasts. Brandon's father went first, telling charming stories about his son's childhood ambition and natural leadership. My father went second. He stood slowly, cleared his throat, and smiled at the room with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention. He talked about Kristin's determination and grace. He mentioned her academic achievements and her thriving career in marketing. He praised Brandon for recognizing what an exceptional woman his daughter was. And then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "We're blessed to have raised a daughter who understands the value of hard work and smart decisions. Who knows that success isn't given, it's earned." Kristin represents everything we hope to instill in our children. The emphasis on singular child wasn't lost on me. Neither was the implication. I sat at table 17, invisible and irrelevant, while my father essentially erased me from the family narrative in front of 200 witnesses. The room applauded. Glasses clinked. Kristin stood to hug our father, her eyes glistening with emotion. My mother watched with satisfaction, her expression radiating approval. I picked up my water glass and drank slowly, focusing on the cold liquid sliding down my throat instead of the heat building behind my eyes. This wasn't new. This was the accumulated weight of 34 years of being the disappointment, the footnote, the daughter who didn't fit the image they wanted to project. But something shifted in that moment. Maybe it was watching my father publicly claim only one child. Maybe it was the careless cruelty of seating me with strangers at my own sister's wedding. Maybe it was Derek's condescension or Brandon's pity or my mother's endless disappointment. Whatever it was, something inside me finally bent past its breaking point. I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted folder I kept for exactly this kind of moment. Inside were PDFs of every relevant document. Lease agreements. Property deeds. LLC registration papers. Bank statements showing cash flow from hundreds of tenants across 15 states. Financial summaries that proved I'd built something extraordinary while they'd been busy dismissing me as a failure. I'd never planned to reveal any of it. The anonymity was part of the strategy. It protected me from jealousy and greed and the kind of family dynamics that turned toxic when money entered the equation. But sitting there, listening to conversation and laughter swirl around me while I remained invisible, I realized I was done protecting people who'd never protected me. I was done being small so they could feel big. I was done playing poor so they could play successful. The band launched into their first song. Kristin and Brandon took the floor for their first dance, spinning elegantly while cameras flashed and guests sighed at the romance of it all. I watched them move across the polished floor, watched my parents watching them with unconcealed pride, and made a decision that would change everything. I opened my messaging app and typed a quick text to Marcus Tran, my real estate attorney. "I need you to prepare a comprehensive portfolio summary. Everything. All properties, all LLCs, all financial data. I need it to look official and undeniable. I need it by tomorrow morning." His response came within 2 minutes. "Consider it done. Anything specific you want highlighted?" I thought for a moment, then typed, "Highlight any properties where immediate family members are current tenants. Cross-reference their names with lease agreements. Make it impossible to miss." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Marcus was sharp enough to read between the lines. "This is the nuclear option," he wrote. "You sure you want to go there?" I looked across the ballroom at my family. My mother laughing with her sister. My father shaking hands with Brandon's colleagues. Kristin radiant in her expensive dress, living a life funded by parents who'd written me off years ago. I typed back, "I've never been more certain of anything." The rest of the reception blurred past in a haze of forced smiles and avoided conversations. I picked at my filet mignon. I declined wedding cake. I nursed a single glass of wine while others got progressively louder and looser around me. When my mother approached my table near the end of the evening, I almost didn't recognize the expression on her face. It might have been concern or possibly just annoyance that I was still present. "You've been awfully quiet tonight," she observed, standing just far enough away to maintain distance. "Everything all right?" I looked up at her, this woman who'd given birth to me but never quite figured out how to see me. "Fine," I answered. "Just taking it all in." She nodded slowly. "Kristin looked beautiful, didn't she?" "Absolutely. And Brandon's family is lovely. So accomplished. It's nice to see our family connected to that kind of success." Our family. The words stung worse because she believed them. She genuinely thought this wedding, this union, elevated the Hayes name while my existence somehow diminished it. You should think about settling down yourself, she continued, her voice taking on that familiar lecturing tone. You're not getting younger, Veronica. At some point, you need to think practically about your future. Find someone stable who can provide security. You can't rent cheap apartments forever. I could have told her then. Could have explained that I didn't need someone to provide security because I'd built it myself. That my net worth exceeded everyone in this room combined. That her concept of my future was laughably small compared to the reality I'd constructed. Instead, I smiled and said, I'll keep that in mind, Mom. She patted my shoulder with the kind of distant affection you'd show a neighbor's dog. Good girl. Try to enjoy the rest of the evening. And for heaven's sake, fix your hair. You look disheveled. She walked away, disappearing into the crowd of guests who mattered, leaving me alone at table 17 with empty chairs and cold coffee. I sat there until the band played their final song. I sat there until the lights came up and staff began clearing tables. I sat there until my sister and her new husband made their grand exit through a tunnel of sparklers and well wishes, off to some luxury honeymoon that would be documented extensively on social media. And then I stood, collected my canvas bag, and walked out of the ballroom with my head high and my secret intact. But not for much longer. By tomorrow morning, everything would change. The documents Marcus prepared would arrive in my email. The truth I'd buried for years would surface like something long submerged finally breaking through to air. And my family, the people who'd spent decades making me feel invisible, were about to discover exactly who they'd been overlooking. The morning after the wedding, I woke to sunlight streaming through thin hotel curtains and the sound of seagulls fighting over discarded boardwalk fries. My phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. 12 missed calls. 27 text messages. Most from Tasha, my roommate and closest friend, asking if I'd survived the family circus. One from Shelby asking about the Louisiana vacancy situation. And 3 from my mother, each one progressively more terse. Call me. We need to discuss your behavior last night. This is getting ridiculous, Veronica. I hadn't done anything at the reception beyond exist quietly in my assigned corner. Apparently even that had been too much. I ignored the messages and opened my email instead. Marcus had delivered exactly as promised. The attachment was labeled Hayes Portfolio Summary Confidential and ran 47 pages when I scrolled through it. Property addresses. Purchase dates. Current market valuations. Monthly revenue streams. Tenant names with lease terms. And there, highlighted in yellow on page 12, was the section I'd requested. Current tenants with familial connections. The first entry made my chest tighten even though I'd known it would be there. Gerald and Diane Hayes. Property address, 2847 Heritage Oaks Lane, Tampa, Florida. Lease term, 24 months. Monthly rent, $2,800. Landlord entity, Gulf Coast Management Group LLC. I'd purchased the townhouse 3 years ago when the previous owner decided to relocate for work. It had been a solid investment property in a desirable neighborhood with good schools and low crime. I'd renovated the kitchen, updated the bathrooms, and listed it for rent at market rate. My parents had applied through the standard channels, submitted their documentation, passed the background check, and signed a lease without ever knowing their daughter owned the property. Every month, their rent payment auto-drafted from their account and deposited into my business account. Every month, I ensured their maintenance requests were handled promptly by my property management team. They'd lived there for 36 months, paying me over $100,000, never once suspecting the truth. The second entry was somehow worse. Kristin Hayes Whitmore and Brandon Whitmore. Property address, 428 Riverside District, Savannah, Georgia. Lease term, 12 months. Monthly rent, $3,400. Landlord entity, Seabreeze Property Holdings LLC. My sister's beautiful colonial with the wraparound porch and the garden she posted about constantly on social media. The house she'd told everyone she and Brandon had found through some exclusive realtor who specialized in historic properties. The house where she hosted dinner parties and book clubs and carefully curated gatherings designed to showcase her sophisticated lifestyle. She'd been living in my property for 8 months. She'd thrown a housewarming party where my mother gushed about Kristin's excellent taste and smart financial planning. Nobody had invited me to that party either. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the document that contained years of secrets compressed into clean corporate language. There were other properties too. Aunt Lorraine's condo in North Carolina where she vacationed every summer. Cousin Derek's investment property in Austin that he'd bragged about buying at a foreclosure auction, except he hadn't bought it, he was leasing it from one of my LLCs and subletting it to college students. Even Brandon's parents rented a vacation home in Tennessee that I'd acquired 2 years ago as part of a bulk portfolio purchase. My family had built their lives on foundations I owned, all while treating me like I was incapable of building anything at all. I forwarded the document to my personal email and saved it in 3 separate cloud locations. Then I showered, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, and checked out of the Comfort Inn. The drive back to Tampa took 90 minutes through flat highway stretches and clusters of tourist traps advertising fresh citrus and airboat rides. I kept the radio off, preferring silence to think through what came next. Revealing the truth wasn't just about satisfaction or vindication. It was strategic demolition. Once my family knew what I'd built, the entire dynamic would shift. They'd have questions. Demands. Expectations. My mother would want to know why I'd hidden it. My father would want to discuss investment strategies and growth projections. Kristin would feel betrayed or embarrassed or both. The anonymity that had protected me for years would evaporate, and I'd have to navigate relationships that were already strained under the added weight of financial revelation. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was continuing to sit at table 17 for the rest of my life, watching my family celebrate each other while erasing me from every narrative that mattered. I pulled into the parking lot of Coral Bay Apartments just after 2 in the afternoon. The complex looked exactly as it had when I'd purchased it 4 years ago, except better. Fresh paint on the exterior. New landscaping along the walkways. Updated playground equipment where children shrieked and laughed under the supervision of tired parents. I'd installed security cameras, improved the lighting, and hired a management company that actually responded to tenant concerns. The place had been struggling when I bought it. Now it thrived. Tasha's car was parked in its usual spot near our building. I climbed the exterior stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked the door to Unit 304, the apartment I'd called home since completing my first major renovation. The space was small but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with updated appliances I'd installed myself, and a living room with windows that caught the afternoon sun. Tasha sat on the couch with her laptop, her dark curls piled on top of her head, her expression focused on whatever spreadsheet consumed her attention. She worked in nonprofit development and brought home stories about fundraising disasters and donor drama that usually made me laugh. She looked up when I entered, her face shifting immediately to concern. "Oh, thank God," she said, closing her laptop. "I thought maybe they'd finally pushed you into the ocean." "How bad was it?" I dropped my bag by the door and collapsed into the armchair across from her. On a scale of 1 to disowned, I'd say a solid 8. Tasha winced. "What happened?" "The usual. Seated me in the back. Didn't tell me about the pre-wedding brunch. My dad gave a toast about how proud he is of his daughter, singular. My mom suggested I find a man to provide financial security. Derek offered to get me a better job out of pity. Oh, and Brandon made sure everyone knew I live in a rough starter neighborhood." She shook her head slowly, her jaw tight with the kind of anger only best friends can access on your behalf. "I will never understand your family. Never. They act like you're some kind of charity case when you're literally the most financially responsible person I know." The irony wasn't lost on me. Tasha knew I was careful with money. She knew I worked full-time and picked up occasional side projects. She knew I'd helped her through 2 separate financial emergencies with loans I'd never asked her to repay. What she didn't know was the scope of what I'd built or the fact that she'd been paying rent to me for the past 4 years through the same property management company that handled all my Tampa holdings. I'd kept that detail private not because I didn't trust her, but because mixing friendship with business felt complicated. Now, sitting in our shared living room with Marcus's document burning a hole in my phone, I wondered if it was time to start untangling some of those complications. "I'm thinking about telling them," I said quietly. Tasha's eyebrows shot up. "Telling them what?" "About the properties. About everything I've been building while they've been busy writing me off as a failure." For a long moment, Tasha just stared at me. Then she leaned forward, her voice dropping to that careful tone people use when they think you might be having a breakdown. "Ronnie, what properties? What are you talking about?" So I told her. Not everything, not the full portfolio or the exact numbers, but enough. Enough about the first duplex I'd bought 10 years ago with money I'd saved from 3 jobs and a small inheritance from my grandmother. Enough about how I'd learned to renovate properties myself, how I'd studied market trends and tenant laws and property management strategies like other people studied for graduate degrees. Enough about the LLCs and the systematic expansion and the decision to keep it all quiet because I'd watched what money did to families. I told her about my parents' townhouse and Kristin's colonial and the dozens of other properties generating income while my family pitted my supposed poverty. Tasha listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that might have been awe or possibly anger. When I finished, she sat back against the couch cushions and exhaled slowly. "So you're telling me that you own this building? This actual building we're sitting in right now?" I nodded. "All 156 units." She gestured around our modest apartment. "And you live here, in this 2-bedroom with the weird shower pressure and the cabinets that stick, because why exactly?" "Because it's practical. Because I don't need space I won't use. Because every dollar I don't spend on impressing people goes back into growing the portfolio." Her laugh came out sharp and disbelieving. "Your family thinks you're broke. They think you're struggling. And the whole time, you've been their landlord. That's objectively insane, Ronnie. You know that, right?" "Maybe. But it worked. I got to build something real without interference or judgment or family drama infecting every decision." She shook her head, still processing. "And now you want to tell them? Why? What changed?" I thought about the wedding. About table 17 and my father's toast and my mother's endless disappointment. About the way Brandon had looked at me like I was something that needed fixing and Derek had offered me a job like he was doing charity work. About 34 years of being invisible in a family that only valued visible success. "Because I'm tired of being erased," I said simply. "I'm tired of playing small so they can feel big." Tasha was quiet for a moment, then reached over and squeezed my hand. "Okay. If you're doing this, I'm with you. But Ronnie, you need to be ready for the fallout. People don't handle this kind of thing well. Your family's going to feel betrayed or embarrassed or both." "I know. That's kind of the point." The next morning, I drove to my day job at Hartman Consulting Group, the downtown firm where I'd worked for 6 years doing administrative support. The office occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower with views of the bay and enough corporate artwork to fill a small museum. I arrived early as always, made coffee in the break room, and settled at my desk to handle emails and scheduling requests. My co-workers filtered in gradually. Craig from accounting stopped by my desk with his usual insufferable cheerfulness. "Morning, Ronnie. How was your weekend?" "My sister's wedding. It was lovely." "Oh nice, nice. Must be weird watching siblings do well when you're, still figuring things out." He said it casually, without malice, which somehow made it worse. Craig genuinely believed he was being sympathetic. He believed my life was something to be figured out while his, with his middle management title and his leased BMW, represented success. I smiled blandly. Everyone's timeline is different. Sure. Just saying, if you ever want resume advice or interview tips, I've been through the corporate ladder. Happy to help. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me staring at my computer screen with my jaw clenched. This was my life. This was the role I'd accepted and maintained for years because it provided cover for the real work happening behind the scenes. But Craig's casual condescension felt different now, sharper, like a splinter I could no longer ignore. My phone buzzed with a text from Kristin. Brunch this Sunday at Mom and Dad's. Bring something for the table. It was an order, not an invitation, delivered with the assumption that I'd comply. Sunday family brunches had been a tradition for years. I usually showed up with a store-bought dessert and endured 2 hours of conversation that flowed around me like water around a stone. This time, I decided, would be different. I spent the week preparing. Marcus refined the portfolio summary into a presentation format with clean graphics and undeniable data. Shelby helped me pull together photos of properties before and after renovation, showing the physical transformation I'd overseen across 15 states. I compiled news articles about real estate markets in cities where I held significant assets. I gathered every lease agreement, every mortgage statement, every proof of ownership that demonstrated the scope and legitimacy of what I'd built. By Friday evening, I had a leather portfolio containing everything I needed to dismantle my family's perception of me in a single sitting. Tasha watched me work from the couch, alternating between supportive silence and occasional warnings. You're going full scorched earth with this, she observed. You know there's no walking it back once you show them, right? I know. And you're okay with that? With your mom losing her mind? Your dad probably trying to give you business advice you don't need? Kristin feeling however she's going to feel about living in your property? I looked up from the documents spread across our coffee table. I've spent my entire adult life managing their feelings. Staying small so they'd feel comfortable. Hiding success so they wouldn't feel threatened. I'm done with that. If they can't handle the truth, that's their problem, not mine. Tasha nodded slowly. Okay then. Burn it down. Just promise me you'll call after so I know you survived. Saturday morning, I drove out to one of my North Carolina properties, a small cabin near the Blue Ridge Mountains that I'd inherited from my grandmother and never told my family about. The place had been in rough shape when I took ownership. Leaking roof. Rotted deck. Plumbing that groaned and sputtered. I'd spent 3 summers renovating it myself, learning carpentry and electrical work from YouTube videos and patient hardware store employees. Now it generated modest income as a vacation rental, booked solid most weekends by families wanting mountain getaways. I walked through the empty cabin, checking that everything was in order for the guests arriving that evening. Fresh linens on the beds. Firewood stacked on the porch. Welcome basket on the kitchen counter with local honey and homemade jam from a nearby farm. My grandmother had left me this place with a handwritten note tucked into the deed. For Veronica, who sees what others miss. Build something beautiful here. She'd been the only family member who'd ever really seen me, who'd encouraged my interest in properties and investments when everyone else dismissed it as impractical. She died 3 years before I bought my first rental, but I'd carried her words through every acquisition, every renovation, every decision to expand the portfolio. This cabin represented where it all started. The belief that I could build something meaningful even if nobody was watching. Tomorrow, I'd show my family exactly what I'd built. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what they'd think. I was ready to stop being invisible, even if visibility came with consequences I couldn't predict or control. Sunday morning arrived with humidity that made the air feel thick enough to swim through. I dressed carefully, choosing slacks and a blouse that looked professional without trying too hard. The leather portfolio sat on my passenger seat as I drove to my parents' townhouse, the same townhouse I owned and they rented without knowing. I'd driven past this property hundreds of times over the past 3 years, but never with the intention of revealing the truth. My hands were steady on the wheel. My breathing was calm. Whatever happened in the next few hours would reshape my family relationships permanently, but I'd made peace with that possibility. I parked on the street and grabbed the portfolio. The front yard looked immaculate. My property management team did excellent work. I walked up the stone path and knocked, even though my mother had told me years ago to just come in for family gatherings. Diane answered wearing a silk robe and an expression of mild surprise. You're early. Brunch isn't for another hour. I smiled. I know. I wanted to talk to you and Dad before everyone else arrives. Is that okay? She hesitated, clearly uncertain whether my presence warranted interrupting her morning routine, but ultimately stepped aside. Your father's in his office. I'll get him. She disappeared down the hallway while I stood in the entryway of my own property, waiting to blow up the carefully constructed fiction that had sustained my family's perception of reality for years. This was it. The moment everything changed. And I'd never felt more certain that I was making exactly the right choice. My father emerged from his office wearing reading glasses and holding a coffee mug that said "World's Best Dad," a gift from Kristin 3 Christmases ago. Gerald Hayes looked at me with the same expression he'd use for an unexpected package delivery. Veronica. What's this about? Can't it wait until brunch? I held up the leather portfolio. It really can't. This is important, and I'd prefer to discuss it before Kristin and everyone else arrives. My mother reappeared, having traded her robe for casual linen pants and a cream sweater. She looked between us with growing impatience. Well, come into the living room then. We don't have all morning. They settled onto the couch they'd chosen when they moved in 3 years ago, the same couch I'd approved as part of their lease agreement allowing them to furnish the space as they preferred. I remained standing, the portfolio clutched against my chest like armor. For a moment, I almost lost my nerve. These were my parents. The people who'd raised me, fed me, sent me to college even if they'd compared my state school education unfavorably to Kristin's private university experience. But then I remembered the wedding. Table 17. The toast that erased me. The decades of small cuts that had bled me slowly until I'd learned to stop feeling them. I need to show you something, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It's going to be surprising, and you're probably going to have questions. I'm asking you to look at everything before you react. My father set his coffee mug on the table. This sounds ominous. Are you in some kind of trouble? Financial trouble? Because Veronica, if you've gotten yourself into debt, we've told you about those predatory credit cards. I'm not in debt. Actually, I'm the opposite of in debt. My mother's expression sharpened. What does that mean? I opened the portfolio and removed the first document, a single-page executive summary Marcus had prepared specifically for this moment. It listed my total property count, estimated portfolio value, average monthly revenue, and net worth calculation. I placed it on the coffee table between us and stepped back. My father picked it up first. His eyes scanned the page once, quickly, then again more slowly. His face went through several distinct expressions. Confusion. Disbelief. Something that might have been irritation. Diane, he said quietly, look at this. My mother leaned over, reading the summary with the kind of focused intensity she usually reserved for charity foundation budgets. When she finished, she looked up at me with narrowed eyes. What is this? Some kind of joke? It's not a joke. That's a summary of my real estate portfolio. I own 340 properties across 15 states. The total value is approximately $42 million. The monthly net income averages around $230,000. The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. My father set the paper down carefully. Veronica, he said slowly, if this is some kind of scam you've gotten involved with, we need to talk about it seriously. Those pyramid scheme real estate programs prey on people who don't understand how money actually works. It's not a scam. I bought my first property 10 years ago with money Grandma Louise left me. I've been acquiring and managing properties ever since. My mother made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. That's absurd. You work as a secretary. You drive a car that's falling apart. You live in that terrible apartment complex. If you had this kind of money, why would you live like that? I pulled out the second document, the detailed property list with addresses, purchase dates, and current valuations. I own Coral Bay Apartments. all 156 units. I live there because it's my property and it made sense to be close to my first major investment. I handed them the list. My father's hands trembled slightly as he took it. He scrolled through pages of addresses in cities spanning from Florida to Kansas, each entry showing purchase price, renovation costs, current market value, and monthly rental income. The numbers were undeniable. So were the LLC names attached to each property, names I'd registered legally and maintained meticulously for years. "This can't be real," my mother whispered, but her voice had lost its certainty. "If you had money like this, we would have known. Someone would have told us." "Why would anyone tell you?" "I've been extremely careful to keep my business private. I use LLCs. I work through property management companies. I don't advertise my ownership. The whole point was building something without interference or judgment." My father looked up from the papers, his face pale. "Why would you hide this from your family? What possible reason could you have for lying to us for 10 years? "I didn't lie. You never asked what I was doing with my time or my money. You assumed I was failing because I didn't fit your definition of success. I let you assume it because it was easier than constantly defending my choices." My mother stood abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. "This is ridiculous. You're telling me you've been pretending to be poor while secretly being wealthy? What kind of person does that? Someone who got tired of being compared to Kristin every single day. Someone who wanted to build something without being told it wasn't good enough or wasn't done the right way. Someone who learned that the only way to have peace in this family was to stay invisible." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and honest in a way I'd never allowed myself to be before. My father set the property list down and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "Even if this is true, and I'm still not convinced it is, why are you telling us now? What changed?" I reached into the portfolio and pulled out the highlighted section, the one showing family members as current tenants. I placed it in front of them. "This changed. You've been living in one of my properties for 3 years. Kristin's been in another for 8 months. You've been paying rent to companies I own, living in houses I purchased and renovated, all while telling me I needed to get my life together and find someone to provide financial security." My mother grabbed the document, her eyes scanning the highlighted entries. Her face went from pale to flushed. "You own this house? This house we're sitting in right now? Every square foot. I bought it when the previous tenant relocated for work. You applied to rent it through Gulf Coast Management Group. You passed the background check. You signed a lease. You've paid me $2,800 every month for 36 months. That's over $100,000, Mom. You've been my tenant for 3 years and never knew it." My father stood slowly, his hands braced against his knees like he needed support. Gerald Hayes, who'd built and sold a successful pharmaceutical distribution company, who'd lectured me countless times about business acumen and market timing, stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Kristin too? She's living in your property?" "The Colonial in Savannah. I acquired it 2 years ago as part of a multi-property purchase in historic districts. She applied to rent it last year. Her lease runs through next spring." My mother's voice came out thin and strained. "But she told us she found that house through an exclusive realtor. She had a housewarming party. She posted about it online like it was some major accomplishment." "It is an accomplishment. She found a beautiful home in a competitive market and secured it with a solid lease agreement. The fact that her landlord happens to be her sister doesn't diminish that. What diminishes it is the way this family has spent years acting like I'm incapable of accomplishing anything while literally living inside my accomplishments." My father sank back onto the couch. He looked older suddenly, the lines around his mouth deeper. "I don't understand. If you had this kind of success, why wouldn't you share it? Why wouldn't you let us celebrate with you?" "Because you wouldn't have celebrated. You would have criticized my methods or questioned my decisions or found some way to make it about what I was doing wrong instead of what I was doing right. You've been doing that my entire life, Dad. Nothing I ever achieved was good enough because it wasn't what Kristin achieved. So I stopped trying to get your approval and focused on building something that didn't require it. My mother sat down heavily beside my father. Her carefully maintained composure had cracked, revealing something raw underneath. You're saying this is our fault? That we drove you to deceive us? I'm saying you drove me to protect myself. There's a difference. My father leafed through the documents again, his trained eye catching details he'd missed the first time. Some of these properties were purchased during the recession. You were barely out of college. How did you even know how to do this? I studied. I learned. I made mistakes and corrected them. I worked 3 jobs to save for down payments. I watched every dollar and reinvested every profit. I did exactly what you always told me to do, Dad. I took calculated risks and knew when to strike. I just didn't do it in a way you recognized as legitimate. He was quiet for a long moment, then tapped one entry on the property list. This one in Austin. This is Derek's investment property. The one he's always bragging about at family gatherings. He doesn't own it. He leases it from one of my LLCs and sublets the rooms to college students. He's making about $800 a month in profit from my property while telling everyone he's a real estate genius. My mother pressed her fingers to her temples. Does anyone else know about this? Aunt Lorraine? Brandon's parents? I flipped to another highlighted section showing additional family connections. Lorraine summers in a North Carolina condo I own. Brandon's parents vacation in a Tennessee cabin that's part of my portfolio. Half the family has touched my properties without realizing it. You've all been living your lives inside an empire I built while treating me like I couldn't build a house of cards. The doorbell rang, breaking the thick tension that had settled over the room. My mother glanced at the antique clock on the mantel, a piece she'd bought at an estate sale and I'd approved as decor for the rental property. That's Kristin. She's early. My father looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Are you going to tell her? Right now? That was always the plan. This isn't just about you two. This is about the entire family understanding who I actually am instead of who you've decided I should be. My mother stood and smoothed her sweater with shaking hands. Veronica, if you do this, if you embarrass your sister at a family brunch with this information, there will be consequences. You can't just drop a bomb like this and expect everything to be fine. I've been dealing with consequences my whole life, Mom. Consequences for not being Kristin. Consequences for making different choices. Consequences for existing in a way that didn't fit your image of what this family should look like. For once, maybe you can deal with some consequences too. The doorbell rang again, more insistently. My mother walked to the door like she was heading to an execution. I heard Kristin's bright voice in the entryway, cheerful and warm in that way she had when things were going well. Mom, you won't believe the photos from the wedding. The photographer sent previews and they're absolutely stunning. Brandon looks like a movie star in every single one. She appeared in the living room doorway carrying a bakery box and radiating the kind of contentment that comes from a perfect wedding and an expensive honeymoon. Her smile faltered when she saw me standing there with documents spread across the coffee table. Oh. Ronnie. I didn't know you'd be here this early. She set the bakery box on the side table and glanced between our parents' strained faces and my neutral expression. Is everything okay? What's going on? Dad, you look like someone died. Nobody died, my father said quietly. Your sister has some information to share with us. Apparently, she's been keeping secrets. Significant secrets. Kristin looked at me with genuine confusion. Secrets? What kind of secrets? I gestured to the documents on the coffee table. Maybe you should sit down. This is going to take a minute to explain. She sat slowly in the armchair across from our parents, her perfect posture and designer casual outfit making her look like she'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. I remained standing, the portfolio still in my hands, and prepared to dismantle my sister's understanding of our family dynamics just as thoroughly as I dismantled our parents' perception of my life. You know that beautiful colonial you're renting in Savannah? The one you found through the exclusive realtor? The one you've been posting about for months like it's proof you've made it? Kristin's brow furrowed. What about it? I own it. I bought that property 2 years ago along with 6 others in Savannah's historic district. You're not renting from some faceless corporation. You're renting from me. You've been paying me $3,400 every month since you moved in. That's over $27,000, Kristin. You've been funding your little sister's real estate portfolio while thinking I was barely surviving on an admin assistant salary. My sister's face went through a remarkable transformation. Confusion. Disbelief. Something that looked almost like betrayal. That's not possible. You don't own real estate. You can't even afford to go out to dinner half the time. I handed her a copy of the lease agreement, her signature clear at the bottom next to Brandon's. Her name and his, right there in legal language, agreeing to rental terms with Seabreeze Property Holdings LLC, one of the companies I'd established 6 years ago specifically to manage coastal and historic properties. The landlord listed on your lease is me. The property management company you call when something needs fixing works for me. Every amenity you've enjoyed in that house exists because I renovated it and maintained it to high standards. Kristin stared at the lease like it might dissolve if she looked hard enough. But why would you hide this? If you own properties, if you're successful, why would you let everyone think you're struggling? I looked at my sister, this golden child who'd never had to question whether she belonged or whether her accomplishments mattered. Because the moment I stopped struggling in your eyes, I stopped being manageable. As long as you all thought I needed help, you could feel superior. You could offer advice and pity and maintain the family hierarchy where Kristin succeeds and Ronnie survives. The second you knew the truth, everything would shift, and none of you were ready for that shift. My mother found her voice again, stronger now but edged with anger. So you manipulated us. You became our landlord and Kristin's landlord and you never said a word. That's manipulation, Veronica. That's deceitful. I filed legal paperwork. I registered businesses. I maintained properties to code. I provided good housing at fair market rates. Nothing I did was deceitful. What was deceitful was the way this family has treated me for 34 years. Telling me I'd never amount to anything while cashing checks that proved otherwise. Acting like Kristin was the only daughter worth celebrating while sitting in furniture I approved for a house I own. Kristin set the lease down with trembling hands. I need to know everything. Right now. How many properties? How long has this been going on? What else have you been hiding? So I told her. I walked through the timeline starting with Grandma Louise's inheritance and my first duplex purchase. I explained how I'd learned renovation skills and property management strategies. I detailed the systematic expansion across 15 states, the formation of multiple LLCs, the decision to maintain my day job as cover. I showed her the portfolio summary with its undeniable numbers. 340 properties. $42 million in total value. Monthly income that exceeded what most people earned in a year. I laid it all out clinically, watching my sister's face process information that fundamentally contradicted everything she thought she knew about me. When I finished, Kristin looked at our parents. You really didn't know? They really had no idea? Gerald shook his head slowly. We had no idea. Your sister has apparently been living a double life for a decade. My sister turned back to me, her voice small. The wedding. When Dad gave that toast about being proud of his daughter, singular. You already knew you'd done more than I ever had. You sat there and let him erase you even though you could have corrected him. What was I supposed to do, Kristin? Stand up and announce my net worth in the middle of your reception? Interrupt Dad's speech to hand out property portfolios? You wanted that day to be perfect. I gave you that. But I'm done giving pieces of myself away so the rest of you can feel comfortable. The room fell into heavy silence. Outside, I could hear neighborhood sounds. A lawnmower. Children playing. Normal Sunday morning activities for people whose families weren't imploding over real estate revelations. My father finally spoke, his voice carrying a weight I'd rarely heard. I need time to process this. We all do. But Veronica, you have to understand that this changes everything. The family dynamic, the relationships, the way we interact going forward. Everything is different now. I know. That's exactly why I'm telling you. Because I'm tired of things being the way they were. I'm tired of being invisible and dismissed and treated like a cautionary tale. You want things to be different? They're different now. You're looking at someone who built something extraordinary while you were busy not noticing. That's on you, not me. My mother stood again, her composure returning in fragments. I think you should leave. We need to discuss this as a family before we can have any further conversation. I'm family too, Mom. Despite your best efforts to erase that fact. She flinched but didn't back down. As the primary family. Your father and Kristin and me. We need to talk privately. I'd been expecting this. The closing of ranks. The circling of wagons around the people who mattered while pushing out the one who dared to disrupt the established order. Fine. You know where to find me. I'll be at the apartment you think is a terrible place to live. The apartment I own. In the building I purchased and renovated. Living my life exactly the way I choose to live it. I collected the documents from the coffee table, sliding them back into the leather portfolio with steady hands. Kristin watched me with an expression I couldn't interpret. Hurt, maybe. Or anger. Or some complicated combination of emotions that would take her days to untangle. I walked to the door without looking back. My mother followed, maintaining her hostess obligations even in crisis. As I stepped onto the porch, she spoke quietly. You've always been difficult, Veronica. Always made things harder than they needed to be. And you've always needed me to be smaller than I am. I guess we've both been consistent. I walked to my car, loaded the portfolio into the passenger seat, and drove away from my rental property with my tenant parents and sister inside processing revelations that would reshape every interaction we'd have for the rest of our lives. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed even. I'd known this moment would be difficult. I'd prepared for anger and denial and accusations. What I hadn't fully anticipated was the strange sense of lightness that came with finally being seen, even if being seen meant being temporarily rejected. For the first time in my adult life, I'd shown my family exactly who I was without apology or diminishment. Whatever came next, I'd face it as myself, completely and unapologetically. The pretending was over. The truth was out. And there was no going back to the comfortable lie of Veronica Hayes, the struggling younger sister who'd never quite measured up. The drive back to Coral Bay took 15 minutes but felt like hours. My phone started buzzing before I'd even reached the highway. Text after text lighting up the screen mounted on my dashboard. Kristin asking how I could do this to her. My mother demanding I call immediately. My father writing in careful sentences that I knew he drafted and redrafted before sending. I ignored all of them. Whatever they needed to say could wait until I was ready to hear it. Tasha was waiting on the apartment steps when I pulled into my parking spot. She must have been watching from my car because she stood the moment I opened the door. One look at my face and she knew. You told them. Every single word. Her laugh came out relieved and slightly manic. Oh my God. How bad was it? Scale of 1 to nuclear fallout. Definitely nuclear. My mom kicked me out. Told me they needed to discuss things as primary family, which apparently doesn't include me. Tasha pulled me into a hug right there in the parking lot. I'm sorry. I know that had to hurt even if you were expecting it. The thing was, it didn't hurt the way I'd anticipated. There was relief mixed in with the pain. Liberation tangled up with loss. I'd spent so long carrying the weight of their expectations and disappointments that setting it down felt strange, like my shoulders didn't know what to do without the burden. We went inside and I told her everything. The leather portfolio on the coffee table. My father's disbelief. My mother's anger. Kristin's shock when she learned she'd been living in my property. The way they'd circled around each other and pushed me out, even in the face of undeniable proof that I'd succeeded beyond anything they'd imagined for me. Tasha made tea neither of us drank and let me talk until I'd emptied myself of words. When I finally went quiet, she said something I hadn't expected. You know they're going to come around eventually. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they'll come around because people always do when there's money involved. They'll want things from you. Advice. Loans. Investment opportunities. You've just become the most valuable person in your family, whether they want to admit it or not. The observation sat heavy between us. I'd thought about that possibility during the planning stages but hadn't wanted to believe my family would be that transparent. Now, sitting in the afternoon light filtering through windows I technically owned, I wondered if Tasha was right. If this revelation would simply shift the dynamic from dismissal to extraction. My phone continued its relentless buzzing throughout the afternoon. By evening, I had 43 unread messages and 17 missed calls. I scrolled through them without opening most. Kristin had progressed from hurt to angry to something that looked like bargaining. We need to talk about the lease. About what happens now. Can you call me please? My mother's messages maintained their imperious tone despite the circumstances. This behavior is unacceptable. You owe us an explanation and an apology. Family doesn't deceive family this way. My father, surprisingly, had only sent one message since his initial texts. When you're ready to discuss this rationally, I'd like to understand your business model. Some of your acquisition choices are interesting. That last one almost made me laugh. Even in crisis, Gerald Hayes couldn't resist analyzing business strategy. I wondered if he'd spent the afternoon studying the property list, calculating return on investment, assessing my portfolio diversification. Part of me wanted to call him, to finally have the conversation about real estate and market timing and risk assessment that we'd never had because he'd never believed I was capable of that level of strategic thinking. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. The wound was too fresh, and I needed time to figure out who I was going to be now that the performance was over. Monday morning arrived with thunderstorms that matched my mood. I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. Craig would probably make assumptions about my unreliability. My supervisor would note it in whatever file she kept on underperforming employees. I didn't care. I spent the day in pajamas reviewing property reports and responding to emails from Shelby about maintenance issues in Tennessee and new acquisition opportunities in Virginia. This was my real work. This was what I'd built while everyone else was busy not seeing me. Around noon, my apartment buzzer rang. I checked the video intercom and saw Kristin standing in the lobby, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup. She looked younger without her usual polish, more like the sister I'd grown up with before life and expectations had carved different paths for us. I buzzed her up without speaking. She climbed the 3 flights slowly, and I could hear her footsteps on the concrete stairs, hesitant and deliberate. When I opened the door, we stood looking at each other across the threshold. Can I come in? She asked quietly. It's your building. You don't need my permission. That's not what I meant. I stepped aside and let her enter. She looked around the apartment like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been here dozens of times over the years. Her eyes caught on details she'd probably never noticed before. The quality of the appliances. The updated fixtures. The way everything was maintained to a higher standard than most rental units. This is nice, she said finally. I never really paid attention before, but this is actually really nice. I kept my voice neutral. I maintain all my properties well. It's good business and the right thing to do for tenants. Kristin sat on the couch without being invited, her hands twisted together in her lap. I've been up all night thinking about everything you said. About the properties and the money and how long you've been hiding this. I want to understand, Ronnie. I really do. But I can't figure out why you thought you had to keep it secret from me. From us. I sat in the armchair across from her, maintaining distance. You really can't figure it out? After 34 years of being compared to you? After every achievement I ever had being measured against what you did and found wanting? You can't understand why I'd want to build something without that constant evaluation? She flinched. I never asked to be the golden child. I never asked Mom and Dad to put that pressure on both of us. You didn't have to ask. You just accepted the benefits without questioning what it cost me. Every time they praised you without mentioning me, you smiled and said thank you. Every time they dismissed my choices, you stayed silent. You were complicit, Kristin. Maybe not actively cruel, but complicit in your silence. Tears started forming in her eyes, but I felt surprisingly unmoved. I'd cried enough tears over family dynamics. I was done absorbing everyone else's emotions while suppressing my own. That's not fair, she whispered. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse. You could have said something. Anything. You could have told them to stop erasing me from family photos. You could have insisted my name stay on the graduation program. You could have made sure I had a seat at your wedding reception that wasn't tucked behind the kitchen doors. You could have done 1,000 small things that would have shown you saw what was happening, but you didn't. Because it was easier not to. Kristin wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You're right. You're completely right, and I hate that you're right. I took the easy path. I let them treat you badly because it meant they weren't critical of me. I benefited from your exclusion. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I'm sorry, Ronnie. I'm genuinely sorry for all of it. The apology hung in the air between us. I'd waited years to hear something like it, but now that it had arrived, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Sorry doesn't change anything, I said quietly. It doesn't give me back the years I spent believing I wasn't enough. It doesn't undo the damage of growing up as the disappointing daughter. I know. But it's a start, isn't it? Maybe. I don't know yet. Kristin took a shaky breath. The house in Savannah. What happens now? Do I have to move? Are you going to evict me to make a point? The question irritated me more than it should have. You think that's what this is about? Revenge? Punishing you by taking away your housing? No, Kristin. Your lease is valid. I honor my contracts. You can stay there as long as you want, and I'll continue to maintain the property to the same standards I always have. Nothing changes from a landlord-tenant perspective. But as sisters? I honestly don't know what we are anymore. She nodded slowly, processing. Brandon wants to talk to you. He has questions about property management and investment strategies. He thinks maybe there's a business opportunity here. Of course he does. I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. 24 hours ago, he was making jokes about my starter neighborhood and now he wants business advice. That's exactly the kind of opportunism I was trying to avoid. Kristin had the grace to look ashamed. He doesn't understand how insulting that sounds. I'm working on helping him understand a lot of things. We sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. Mom's upset. Really upset. Dad's in his office running numbers on your portfolio. He's impressed, Ronnie. He won't say it directly, but he's impressed with what you've built. I didn't build it for his approval. I know. But maybe it means something that you have it anyway. It doesn't. Not really. Because if I'd told him 10 years ago what I was planning, he would have lectured me about being unrealistic. He would have explained all the ways I'd fail. He's only impressed now because I succeeded despite his certainty that I couldn't. That kind of approval isn't worth anything to me. Kristin stood slowly, her earlier purpose for coming apparently exhausted. I should go. But Ronnie, for what it's worth, I think what you built is incredible. I think you're incredible, even if I failed to show it when it mattered. Maybe we can find a way forward that doesn't involve so much hurt. I walked her to the door. Maybe. But that's going to take time and actual change, not just apologies and good intentions. She hugged me before leaving, a brief awkward embrace that felt more obligatory than genuine. I watched her descend the stairs and cross the parking lot to her car, this woman who was my sister but also somehow a stranger. We'd grown up in the same house but lived completely different childhoods. She'd been celebrated while I'd been managed. She'd been centered while I'd been cropped out. And now the truth was out, but I wasn't sure if truth was enough to bridge the distance between who we'd been and who we might become. The rest of the week unfolded in strange patterns. My mother didn't call, which told me she was still too angry to speak without saying things she'd regret. My father sent emails with subject lines like portfolio diversification questions and Austin market analysis. I responded to some and ignored others, drawing boundaries around what I was willing to discuss. Cousin Derek left a voicemail that started apologetic and ended presumptuous, suggesting we partner on future acquisitions since we both understood real estate. I deleted it without responding. Work became increasingly difficult to tolerate. Craig's condescension felt sharper now that I knew I could buy his house with a month's revenue. My supervisor's critiques of my filing system rang hollow when I was managing property portfolios across 15 states. I found myself staring at spreadsheets and thinking about how much longer I needed to maintain this cover. The answer, I realized, was that I didn't need to maintain it at all. That reality had shifted the moment I'd laid those documents on my parents' coffee table. On Thursday afternoon, I submitted my resignation letter. 2 weeks' notice, professionally worded, no explanation beyond pursuing other opportunities. My supervisor seemed surprised but not particularly concerned. Craig made a comment about how he hoped my next position would offer more stability. I smiled and said nothing, knowing I'd never see these people again after my notice period ended. That evening, I met with Marcus and Shelby at a restaurant downtown to discuss expanding operations. We'd been managing the portfolio efficiently with our current structure, but growth required different systems. Shelby had proposals for bringing on additional property managers. Marcus suggested restructuring some of the LLCs for better tax advantages. We talked for 3 hours about markets and mortgages and maintenance protocols, the kind of conversation I'd never been able to have with my family because they'd never believed I was capable of it. As we were finishing dessert, Shelby asked the question I'd been avoiding. So when are you going to stop pretending you're not already running a multi-million-dollar empire? When are you going to step into this fully instead of keeping one foot in a day job that doesn't serve you? Soon, I told her. Very soon. The truth was already out to the people who mattered most. The rest was just logistics. Friday brought an unexpected visitor. My father appeared at my apartment door just before dinner, looking uncomfortable in casual clothes that seemed wrong on him somehow. Gerald Hayes belonged in business suits and boardrooms, not jeans and polo shirts. "Can we talk?" he asked. "I'm not here to lecture or criticize. I just want to understand." I let him in and made coffee we both needed. He sat at my small kitchen table and pulled out a notebook filled with his handwriting, questions and observations about my property portfolio. For the next 2 hours, we had the conversation we should have had a decade ago. He asked about my acquisition strategy and due diligence process. I explained how I'd identified undervalued properties and calculated renovation costs. He questioned my financing approach and I walked him through my methods for securing favorable mortgages and managing cash flow. It was the most substantive discussion we'd ever had, and the cruel irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken complete family rupture to get here. "Your approach is sound," he said finally, his tone carrying genuine respect. "Conservative in some ways, aggressive in others. You've built something sustainable, Veronica. That's rare. Most people who come into money lose it quickly because they don't understand fundamentals. You understand fundamentals. I learned from watching you," I told him. "You just never realized you were teaching me." He looked down at his coffee. "I failed you. Your mother and I both failed you in ways I'm only beginning to comprehend. We assumed because you didn't follow Kristin's path that you weren't following any path at all. We measured your worth against the wrong metrics. It's easy to say that now. Now that you know I succeeded. What would you be saying if I'd actually failed? If I really was struggling the way you thought I was?" He didn't have an answer for that, and his silence was more honest than any words could have been. We both knew that if I'd remained the struggling daughter they'd imagined, this conversation would never happen. His respect was conditional on my success, and that conditionality meant it would always carry an asterisk. Before he left, he asked about Thanksgiving. "Your mother wants to know if you'll come. If we can try to move past this as a family." "I'll think about it," I told him, which we both understood meant probably not. That night, I stood on my apartment balcony watching lights flicker across the Coral Bay complex. Families moving through evening routines in units I owned. People building lives in spaces I'd created and maintained. It occurred to me that I'd built my own kind of family, one based on mutual agreement and fair exchange rather than blood obligation and conditional love. These tenants didn't know me, but they benefited from my work. Their rent checks funded my expansion, and my expansion created more housing, better maintained properties, opportunities for people who needed clean, affordable places to live. The revelation to my family was spreading in the way these things do. Aunt Lorraine called with questions about her North Carolina condo. Other relatives reached out with varying degrees of shock and opportunism. Some wanted to understand. Others wanted to benefit. I responded selectively, drawing lines around who deserved my time and who was simply trying to position themselves advantageously now that the power dynamics had shifted. The truth was out, spreading through family networks like ripples across water, changing everything it touched. And I stood at the center of it, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, finally seen for exactly what I'd built. Whether that visibility would heal old wounds or create new ones remained uncertain. But for the first time in my life, I was facing my family as myself, completely and without apology. Whatever came next, I'd face it on my own terms, with my empire solid beneath my feet and my truth finally, irrevocably, spoken. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of my new office space, a modest suite in downtown Tampa that housed my growing property management operation. The walls displayed framed photos of properties I'd renovated, before and after shots that told stories of transformation. Shelby sat across from me reviewing quarterly reports while Marcus finalized paperwork for our latest acquisition, a struggling apartment complex in Virginia that I'd identified as having excellent bones and terrible management. My life had changed in ways both obvious and subtle. I'd stopped pretending to be poor. I'd embraced the reality of what I'd built and started making decisions that aligned with that reality. The Honda Civic was gone, replaced by a practical SUV that could handle property visits across multiple states. My wardrobe had expanded to include clothes that fit properly and didn't come exclusively from clearance racks. I'd hired a part-time assistant to help manage the growing administrative demands of a 340-unit portfolio that was rapidly expanding toward 400. What hadn't changed was my approach. I still lived at Coral Bay, still maintained the same modest 2-bedroom apartment that gave me daily connection to my first major investment. I still drove past properties to check on them personally rather than relying solely on reports. I still answered tenant calls and approved maintenance requests with the same attention I'd given when my portfolio was 5 properties instead of hundreds. Success hadn't made me careless. If anything, it had made me more committed to doing things properly. My relationship with my family had settled into something new and still undefined. Kristin and I spoke every few weeks, conversations that felt careful and deliberate as we learned how to be sisters without the old hierarchies. She'd stopped posting quite so much about her house on social media, which I appreciated even though I'd never asked her to. Brandon had proven surprisingly genuine in his interest in real estate, and we'd had several productive conversations about market analysis that hadn't felt transactional. He was learning to see me as someone other than his wife's disappointing sister. My parents remained complicated. My mother had sent a formal apology letter 3 months after the revelation, typed and grammatically perfect, acknowledging her role in making me feel invisible. It had taken her 2 more months to call and speak the words out loud. We had lunch occasionally now, stilted affairs where we both tried too hard and said too little. But it was something. More than we'd had before. My father had become an unexpected ally. He'd started referring potential investors my way and introducing me at business functions as his daughter who'd built an impressive real estate portfolio. The pride in his voice still felt conditional sometimes, still carried echoes of surprise that I'd managed to succeed, but I'd learned to accept imperfect progress over perfect stagnation. Thanksgiving had been different that year. I'd hosted it at a property I'd recently purchased, a large historic home in St. Petersburg that I was converting into a vacation rental. The family gathered in a space I owned, eating food I'd provided, finally seeing me clearly. There had been awkward moments and careful conversations, but there had also been laughter. Kristin had helped me cook. My father had admired the renovation work. My mother had complimented my hosting skills with what seemed like genuine warmth. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest in a way our family gatherings had never been before. Derek had apologized eventually, shamefaced about his condescension and grateful that I hadn't raised his rent out of spite. Aunt Lorraine had gone quiet, which I interpreted as her own form of processing. The extended family had split into camps, some who thought I'd been justified in my secrecy and others who felt I'd been deceptive. I'd stopped worrying about which camp people fell into. Their opinions didn't change my balance sheets or the quality of housing I provided to hundreds of tenants who depended on me. The biggest change was internal. I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space. I'd stopped minimizing my accomplishments or deflecting when people asked about my work. When someone at a business mixer asked what I did, I said I owned and managed residential properties across 15 states. When they asked how many, I told them. The number didn't feel like bragging anymore. It felt like fact. I'd built something extraordinary, not despite my family's dismissal but perhaps because of it. Their inability to see me had forced me to see myself clearly, to define success on my own terms rather than chasing their approval. Tasha had moved out 2 months ago, upgrading to a larger unit in the same complex after I'd offered her a significant rent reduction as thanks for years of friendship. She'd initially refused, insisting on paying market rate, but I'd convinced her that good tenants who took care of properties were worth incentivizing. We still had dinner twice a week and she'd become an unofficial sounding board for business decisions, offering perspective from someone who knew me before and after the revelation. Standing in my office, looking at Marcus and Shelby discussing expansion strategies, I felt something I hadn't experienced much in my life: contentment. Not happiness exactly, because happiness felt too simple for the complexity of what I'd built and lost and rebuilt differently. But contentment, yes. The deep satisfaction of knowing I'd created something meaningful through my own effort and vision. The properties I owned housed families and individuals who needed stable, well-maintained places to live. The income one generated supported jobs for property managers and maintenance workers and contractors. I'd built an ecosystem that functioned and grew and provided value beyond just my own financial benefit. My phone buzzed with a text from Kristin. "Sending you a listing I saw in Charleston. Looks promising. You should check it out." I smiled and forwarded it to Shelby for initial analysis. My sister had become an unexpected ally in property hunting, sending me opportunities she encountered through her marketing work. We'd found our own way of connecting, one that acknowledged both our past and our present without requiring us to pretend either had been different than it was. The truth had changed everything, just as I'd known it would. But change wasn't the disaster my family had feared or the vindication I'd imagined. It was simply evolution, the natural progression of relationships forced to adapt to new information. Some bonds had strengthened. Others had weakened. All of them had become more honest. I'd lost the safety of invisibility and gained the freedom of being fully seen. That trade, difficult as it had been, was worth everything it had cost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.